All right, we are currently live on YouTube. So I'll just like to, first of all, introduce myself. My name is Rehema Baya, and I'm the communication officer at Heart Kenya. And with us, we have two panelists, Yvonne from Equality Now, and sorry, I'm afraid of butchering your name, but Narhun from UNODC. I'm sorry if I did that. Please introduce yourselves so that I can also hear a little bit about you, and we can then proceed with the webinar. We can start with Yvonne.
Hi, Rahema. I'm Yvonne Oyeke. As you mentioned, I'm with Equality Now in their regional office here in Nairobi. I am working under the End Sex Trafficking thematic area. And basically what we seek to do is through legal advocacy, see the extent to which we can secure the rights of women in Africa. My specific thematic focus is with respect to ending sex trafficking and exploitation.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I can go ahead. So my name is Nurhan Tumoum. I'm the Associate Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer at UNODC's Regional Office for Eastern Africa. And I'm based here in Nairobi as well. And mostly what I do is that I'm responsible for coordinating the normative or legislative component to support member states in strengthening their national legislation in order to effectively combat trafficking in persons. And I make sure as well to be involved in supporting member states in implementing their international legal obligations under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, as well as Trafficking in Persons Protocol. So I cover trafficking in persons generally, and also specifically, like my colleague indicated, other forms of exploitation, and to make sure that there's sufficiently strong legislation to combat these crimes. Thank you.
Rehema, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, so sorry, guys. Okay. So I was just first saying that I've heard the name Nurhan, and I will not butcher your name again. Sorry for that. And just to proceed, I'd like us to just first starting with a basic definition. What is sex trafficking? We can start with you, Nurhan.
Before I talk about sex trafficking specifically, perhaps we can take a step back and say, what is trafficking generally? And because I'm more responsible as well on coordinating the legislative aspect from an international legal standard, I'm just going to look at the definition in the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. And trafficking generally means the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, of the giving or receiving payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. And that's generally what trafficking is considered under international law. But more specifically on sex trafficking, especially when it comes to the trafficking in persons protocol, it is considered one of the means of exploitation, or one of the examples of what exploitation is. Exploitation of any form of sexual exploitation. That's when I refer to the international legal standards. And there are different forms of sex trafficking that can occur, whether it be in terms of sex trafficking, it is child sexual exploitation or a commercial sexual exploitation of children, sex trafficking in terms of pornography. So there are different forms, and it depends very much on the different national or cultural context that we're looking at. And I'm going to give it to Yvonne to add a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with Nohan. The definition of sex trafficking really is rooted in a general understanding of what trafficking is, with sex trafficking focusing specifically on the purpose being for sexual exploitation purposes. And as mentioned by Nohan, it takes very many forms and very many manifestations of sex trafficking, depending on the context in which you're speaking about. It could be sex slavery, it could be prostitution, it could be sex tourism, as is often seen in Kenya. I think that's one of the specific manifestations of sex trafficking that's noted in Kenya. But yes, as mentioned by Nohan, it really just relates to, you know, the recruitment, transportation, etc., for purposes of exploiting someone for sex in these different manifestations.
So maybe we just expand a little bit on that. So we have a situation of sexual abuse, we have a situation of sexual exploitation, we have a situation of sex trafficking. Are there any differences with those terms? Are there any things that maybe separate one from another? Yes, Nurhan?
Yeah, if I may, I mean, if we're looking at trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, we're looking at trafficking as a crime also generally. And for it to be a sex trafficking crime, what there needs to be the act. So for example, someone is recruited through a specific means, whether it's like they were frauded into this recruitment for the purpose of sexual exploitation. So it has to be for the purpose of exploitation, but there also needs to be the act that happens and the means that happen for the crime to be considered trafficking, or for this specific purpose, sex trafficking.
Okay, thank you. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think trafficking has a specific definition, as Nohan has mentioned. And so you're trafficked for a variety of reasons, including for sexual exploitation. And within that context, so you can be exploited for sex, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're trafficked for sex, is what we're trying to explain. And you can experience sexual abuse, but it doesn't always mean that you experience sexual abuse within the context of trafficking, for example. So there are clear delineations between the three different terms, to the extent that trafficking has a specific definition, as Nohan has mentioned, and the reason or the manifestations of how that trafficking manifests itself, or the reasons why I include for the purposes of sexual exploitation within this definition. And within that context, then you can experience sexual abuse, but you know, they're linked, but they are separate in that way.
Okay, just to stay with you, Yvonne, a little bit. Can you explain maybe or talk a little bit about the available laws that govern against sex trafficking from a global perspective, or from a regional perspective, or just from Kenya?
I think in a Kenyan, we can mention in a Kenyan context, because like most states, we have done a good job of an enabling legal and policy framework. And we've also assented to a lot of the international legal documents, as it were. So Kenya is a party to several international and regional instruments. So if you're looking at the definition of sex trafficking, or a framework that includes protections against sex trafficking, you would look at a regional level at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. I think you can definitely interpret in that context protections in that respect. The African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, the protocol to the African Charter on the Rights of Women in Africa. Moving further, I think you can definitely interpret, for example, these protections within the context of CEDAW, the protocol to supplementing the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. At a national level, I think you can certainly interpret certain protections with respect to sex trafficking in the Constitution. We have a Counter Trafficking in Persons Act. There are certain protections offered within the Sexual Offences Act. You can look at the Children's Act. And then I think there are certain policy or national policy frameworks. I think you can certainly look to the policy for the prevention and response to sexual violence. And yeah, I think I can mention those. And I'm not sure if I captured everything. I think I probably left some out.
I think you've mostly captured everything. I mean, aside from the Trafficking in Persons Protocol, which talks about exploitation generally, but that also includes exploitation for the purpose or sexual exploitation. Aside from that, on the international level, and I'm sure, Yvonne, you've already mentioned that the Convention on the Rights of the Child as well, which looks at sexual exploitation, but specifically when it comes to the rights of children. And if we're looking more into national instruments within Kenya, you've already mentioned a couple of instruments on the Children's Act, for example, but also the Sexual Offences Act, which specifically prohibits trafficking for sexual exploitation, prostitution of people with mental disabilities, child trafficking, child sex tourism, which is one of the prevalent one of the prevalent issues that are happening today in East Africa and the region as well. The Sexual Offences Act also prohibits child pornography and exploitation of child pornography. So, whether it's internationally or regionally or nationally, there are a number of instruments that specifically address sex trafficking and prohibit different forms of sexual exploitation, whether of children or adults. And that's when it comes to legislation, but also it is very important to talk about the implementation of that legislation as well.
My follow-up question was actually going to be on the implementation, because even, for example, in Kenya, we have the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act. We also have the National Referral Mechanism. So these are all documents. You can say that they are extensions of the law to try and protect the victim, but the idea sometimes does not follow through because of the implementation. So maybe you can express yourselves a little bit about when it comes to the implementation of these laws, Nurhan from a global perspective and Yvonne from maybe a local perspective. What has been your experience?
So generally, from our work with different member states, including the government of Kenya, which we've been recently working on to strengthen the national legislation on the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, to make sure that different legislations that address trafficking are harmonized as well. Like we were just saying, like having strong laws is really, really important to protect victims, to prosecute perpetrators. But again, it also comes down to the implementation of such laws. And from our experience, and we've seen that a lot with different countries in Eastern Africa, sometimes the laws are even perfect. They are in line with the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Specifically, the definition of trafficking is exactly like it is in the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. And you see sometimes that the law is very well written, has all the different provisions that need to be included to be aligned with the international legal standards. But then you see that the number of convictions are not high. You see that the number of detected victims are not enough as well. So then you look at the implementation, and from what we've seen, there is a very important role that national stakeholders need to play when it comes to combating trafficking in general and sex trafficking in specific. The different roles when it comes to the detection of victims. So first line responders that are working to detect victims, people at airports, immigration, customs, law enforcement officers as well. And then when it comes to the prosecution aspect, you're looking at prosecutors, the judiciary, and other stakeholders. But at the same time, these are people that are working at a government level to combat trafficking crimes generally, but also you want to look at other organizations such as international organizations, UN agencies, NGOs, and civil society. So people, and I'll take you back to one of the 4 Ps when it comes to trafficking to effectively combat this crime. I mean, prevention and prosecution and protection and all of this is important, but also partnership. So it is very important that people on the ground who are working to combat this crime work together and communicate together. And that can happen in different forms. I mean, in Kenya, we have experience related to having a specialized trafficking unit, and that helps a lot in terms of having national coordination and strengthened communication when it comes to trafficking cases. So this is one of the best practices, and this is one of the important things in order to strengthen implementation of the law, to make sure that the different national stakeholders cooperate together, share information regarding trafficking cases together so that they're able to combat it. I mean, trafficking is a crime that can happen nationally, but also transnationally. And this is where another aspect related to international cooperation takes place. So these national stakeholders that are working to combat trafficking, whether it be law enforcement, or prosecutors, what happens if an element of this crime, for example, happens abroad? How will you be able to prosecute someone in Kenya if some of the evidence that you need is abroad? This is where international cooperation comes in handy and becomes very important as well. So it's very important for the stakeholders, the government stakeholders that are working on combating such a crime through effective investigation, prosecution, and so on, to also cooperate with other law enforcement agencies or other prosecutors across the country in order to effectively tackle this crime. I mean, this crime is one of the transnational organized crime that requires a lot of countries to work together as well in order to combat it. So no matter how powerful one country is, it is very, very difficult for one country to be able to combat trafficking on its own, specifically when there's that transnational aspect and traffickers are actually involved in other much broader organized crime that can happen across borders. So I think, yes, we're talking about implementation of the law and how we need not only strong laws, but people that have the capacity to implement this. So one important thing is having strong coordination and cooperation between the national stakeholders. Also having strengthening international cooperation between different countries to work on trafficking cases together, to share information, to share evidence together, but also just generally and most importantly to have to strengthen the capacity of criminal justice practitioners on the ground to effectively combat this crime. First of all, to understand what it means and to understand within the national context in Kenya or in other countries, like what is trafficking, what is sexual exploitation, what are the different forms of exploitation that can happen, how can we differentiate between different crimes, trafficking and smuggling and so on, and how can we effectively ensure more detection of victims, how can we intercept such a crime at airports or other ports of entry, how can we be able to submit cases that are strong in order for traffickers to be convicted. So I think there's a lot that can happen on the implementation side, but most importantly, to have the capacity to combat such a crime, to train individuals that work on trafficking, and to make sure that the people who work on trafficking cases are talking to each other and are communicating the information that they have together.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Nurhan that we do have quite, if I think of the Kenyan context, but I think most maybe countries in the region actually do have quite a robust legal framework when it comes to the protections that it offers from trafficking in all its manifestations. However, when it comes to implementation, I think the two things that we've noted, and this really does echo with what Nurhan has said, is in the first instance, there seems to be a lack, like a general lack of awareness. Even at a global level, when it comes to discourse around trafficking or general discourse around the promotion and protection of women's rights, to the extent that sex trafficking does disproportionately affect women, this specific violation is not often spoken about at a global level. I mean, there could be a variety of reasons for this. The one that's often given is due to its clandestine nature, something that's very hidden. It's not always easy to be able to identify which is a case of trafficking, which is a case of sex trafficking, which is a case of labor trafficking. So due to its clandestine nature and a plethora of other reasons, it's not a very visible crime. It's not a crime that is often spoken about. So it's not something that a lot of people have knowledge about. So knowledge about the law in that respect, the national laws, the regional provisions, is not something that's forefront, I think, across the board. So this is not just at a criminal justice institutional level. I think even in a broader social context, if you actually look at the definition of what trafficking is, you may find that there are a lot of people who are actually involved in trafficking practices for different exploitative reasons, but because we're not fully attuned with what the provisions are, it's not always clear to identify who victims are in that instance. So just to echo Nurhan, there really does seem to be just a general lack of awareness around sex trafficking, but also the gravity of sex trafficking as a violation, the impact that it has not only on the victims or survivors of sex trafficking, but I think in a broader social context. We don't often, it's not something that's often spoken about, which I think also does tend to contribute to this general lack of implementation, because it's very difficult to respond to something that you're not fully aware of, you're not really sure what it means, you're not really sure how it works, you're not really sure what the provisions are. Makes it a little bit more difficult to respond in that specific instance. But then, in addition to that, where there is information, where there is some sort of knowledge, I think there's some misinformation around the knowledge that exists. So the operationalization of the provisions of the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, for example. I think if you look at the statistics, there are not many charges, or there are not many matters that are brought before the courts on the strength of the act itself, despite the fact that it's generally quite comprehensive and inclusive. I think what we understand from speaking with people in the sector is that it's easier to pursue convictions under other legislative enactments. So then the act itself, maybe because there's a lack of awareness on it and how it works and the provisions and how you'd actually be able to come before the courts and the criminal justice system to speak about or to seek justice under these provisions, then becomes problematic. So then there just seems to be, some sort of misinformation around sex trafficking and, its manifestations. And linked to misinformation, I think, is also this stigma that's attached to victims, survivors of sex trafficking, the operation of negative gender norms in a society means that it's not easy for someone to come forward and say that I'm a survivor of sex trafficking without there being certain biases or certain stigma that is attached to you, by virtue of a problem that, you didn't walk into voluntarily. So, all of these things work together to ensure that it becomes infinitely harder to respond to the problem of sex trafficking. Because if you can't identify a victim, if you can't see who you're solving the problem for, sometimes then, the urgency with which you need to respond perhaps is not thought. But just, to echo the comments that Norhan had made, that, for effective implementation, there are a series of things that need to happen across all the sectors within the system.
Sorry.
May I add something else, Rahima?
Yes, please.
Yes, I just wanted to add to something that Yvonne said regarding the legislation itself. And Yvonne spoke about how sex trafficking is a grave crime that disproportionately affects women and young girls as well. And one of the most important things is for people to understand how grave this crime is, how it disproportionately affects certain individuals, specifically women and young girls as well, whether in the region or globally. And this needs to be echoed as well in different national legislation. So for sex trafficking to be effectively criminalized, and for governments to be able to effectively combat such a crime, it is also very important to have punishments that are commensurate with how serious this crime is. So it is very important to have provisions, whether in national anti-trafficking legislation or different forms of legislation. It's very important to make sure that the sex trafficking crimes are punished with, let's say, imprisonment, with sufficient imprisonment or sufficient prison terms, as opposed to fines, for example. I mean, it is very important for countries to make sure that in order to tackle such a grave crime that disproportionately affects women and young girls in the region, it is also equally important to have a strong legislation that makes sure that there is a provision or there is a law that would punish the offenders of such a crime proportionately to how serious this crime is. So that's something that Yvonne talked about a little bit. So I just wanted to mention that on the legislative side. Over to you.
Okay. I really like where the discussion is going. So on the punishment that isn't sufficient, so this is an example, because we have a case that we've been working on as HAT, but also the government has been working on it in terms of now going through the court process and conviction of I don't know if you can remember it, of the 9 Nepalese girls who were trafficked into the country, and this was specifically for sexual exploitation. Okay, And it was just reported a few weeks ago that the businessman who actually brought them in was sentenced to 3 years, in prison. So in terms of sufficiency, I would say that is one of the examples where we have the perpetrator receiving a punishment, but it is not quite sufficient as compared to the crime that they have committed, So just so that we're able to keep the discussion going, can we maybe speak a little bit about how sex trafficking manifests itself? Because sometimes it is the primary goal in terms of exploitation, and sometimes it is the secondary goal. Sometimes the primary form of exploitation could be labor trafficking, and then in the process of labor trafficking, you end up finding yourself in sexual exploitation. So maybe you can speak from now a global perspective from Nurhan and Yvonne, maybe from a local perspective, on how sexual exploitation manifests itself.
Maybe to add to your point on that is, let me go back to some statistics that were also mentioned in the Global Trafficking in Persons report. I mean, forced labor was evidently, specifically in the sub-Saharan region, forced labor was one of the most used forms of exploitation within this region. And after that came sexual exploitation, and 22% of the detected victims were subjected to sexual exploitation coming after forced labor. And you mentioned specifically how someone can be subjected to a form of exploitation such as forced labor, but then they find themselves in a situation of sexual exploitation that they didn't know was going to happen, this change in condition per se. And it is very important to look at that. I mean, trafficking is trafficking, whether it's forced labor, whether it's sexual exploitation, but it's very important to make sure that one, we need to look at the preventive efforts as well in order to prevent both crimes, whether it's trafficking for forced labor or trafficking for sexual exploitation, but also to look at, individuals who are subjected to trafficking for purposes of forced labor, let's say young girls, for example, and then they end up being sexually trafficked or sexually exploited. That puts them in a very vulnerable position and leaves them in a very vulnerable situation as well. So that's something that the international legal framework tries to address. And I'll take you back to a point I made earlier, by having strong laws that punish both crimes effectively and punishes trafficking, and specifically sex trafficking, because it's such a grave crime, effectively. I leave it to Yvonne to answer on that, and maybe I'll reflect back afterwards.
So what we've seen is a nexus for the various ways in which trafficking for sexual exploitation manifests in Kenya is poverty, because that makes whoever's being trafficked disproportionately young girls, women, vulnerable to a variety of social challenges that then results in the situations that we are speaking about. So as mentioned, labor trafficking is often a segue into sex trafficking. So we've heard stories of young girls, for example, who are brought, and it's not only rural to urban, I think you also noted within urban areas, who are moved from their home into another home to, help with the house chores. And in that instance, then they are exposed to sexual abuse, sometimes sexual exploitation, to the extent that, their services are procured for a fee that they, don't always receive, even if they receive it, the exploitation is still there. So that's one example. I think Kenya is also one of the most prevalent forms that we often hear about. I think Kenya and the Gambia, if I'm not mistaken, or Senegal, I really do have high statistics with respect to sex tourism. So, tourist hotspots, tourist destinations, Kenya, especially the coast, and I think within the general Nakuru County area, Naivasha, and surrounding counties that are known for tourism, then you find that young women and girls are often sent, sometimes by their families, to go and look for money. So you have to, sell sex in order to be able to support your family. In some instances, they are trafficked in the strict definition of the definition of the term, from these different areas, maybe even within the same county, maybe from other counties, into these tourism hotspots, where their services are procured for tourism purposes. I think it's the same. Where would that Thailand, if I'm not mistaken, I think would probably also have the same sort of statistics when it comes to sex tourism, to the extent that I think there are actually people who come into Kenya understanding that if you are at the coast or if you are in Naivasha, one of the things you would be able to have access to is easy sex. So I think that's another manifestation of sexual exploitation that we note specifically in Kenya.
If I may add a bit to what Yvonne was saying, and to add a bit of a global perspective on that, specifically UNODC, I mean, we work also with countries and encourage member states as well to address the root causes of trafficking. So Yvonne mentioned, and specifically with regards to sex trafficking, poverty can be a reason why girls or young girls, for example, are lured into trafficking for forced labor, but then they find themselves in situations where they're sexually exploited as well. So it is very important to look at the root causes, whether it's poverty, whether it's lack of access to income opportunity, and especially now with the pandemic, a lot of people have lost their jobs, a lot of people are out of school, and traffickers prey on that. They take advantage of that in order to traffic individuals to get income. So it's important to look at the root causes as well when it comes to sex trafficking specifically, because that's the topic we're talking about. And Yvonne also mentioned, like, specifically within Kenya, but I want to emphasize that this is also an issue that is prevalent in the region and globally. I mean, sex tourism, and specifically child sex tourism as well. And that's the phenomenon where a person travels abroad with the intention of engaging in sexual activity with children. And steps have been taken, but it is very important, whether domestically or internationally, to make sure that this is a crime that is criminalized. So we need to look at whether there are international or regional instruments that prohibit or that have measures to combat sex tourism, and specifically child sex tourism. Countries need to criminalize such an offense as well, whether committed by their citizens abroad, rather than relying on other country to arrest and do the prosecution. So sex tourism is also a prevalent issue in the region, specifically when it comes to children. So it's very important to look at how this is happening, where this is happening, and to support countries in order to take specific measures and to combat this crime, and also have strong laws that criminalize such a crime that happens and affects children who are at a higher risk of being trafficked as well. So these are 2 points that Yvonne mentioned that I wanted to add.
Thank you, Nurhan. So within this same context, we can see that sex trafficking is manifesting itself in different ways, and just maybe to add, you also have, for example, the situation with the group of girls who came from Uganda and were exploited in Kenya, a very large number, and primarily it was for labor trafficking. But in the same situation of vulnerability, you can see situations where these same girls are being exploited sexually, And we also have the people who are traveling to the Middle East, to go and seek work, and they're traveling specifically to go and work, but they find themselves in homes that are making them more and more vulnerable, and they sometimes find themselves being sexually exploited by the particular people who have employed them in those specific homes, So there are very many different ways that sex trafficking or sexual exploitation is manifesting itself. But now we can see that we have some laws that we are trying to implement in different ways to be able to curb this crime. What do you think are, or what can you put like in terms of checkboxes and say these are the milestones, that we've managed to have in this fight, generally in terms of fighting human trafficking, because I know you cannot separate the two, but also as well in terms of curbing sex trafficking?
I mean, are we talking about sort of best practices somehow?
Yeah, best practices, or success stories, or situations that we feel, whether working from UNODC perspective or from an equality now perspective, where we feel like as units on our own in terms of organizations, but as well as a country, or in terms of well as nations, what are we trying to, what milestones are we making? Because at the end of the day, it's still, we are all together in this,
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Rahema. And maybe to take you back a bit further and look at the global picture of it, and to look at the mandate of UNODC generally, which focuses more, let's focus more on the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, as well as the supplementing protocols. And these conventions and protocols have multiple provisions that talk about whether it's criminalization of certain forms of trafficking, including sex trafficking and trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And they also talk about best practices as well to effectively investigate such a crime, to effectively prosecute such a crime, and also has provisions in relation to the protection of victims, as well as the prevention of such a crime before it even happens. So from our side as well, we really do encourage countries that are really working hard to effectively combat trafficking and sex trafficking, in this for the purpose of this webinar as well, is to look at the international legal conventions that they have ratified, look at the provisions. I mean, these conventions are also here to provide support to member states to combat such a crime, and having stronger national laws that are in line with international legal obligations will make sure that these crimes that are happening, the sex trafficking crimes, are sufficiently criminalized and punished. It will make sure that there's effective investigation, that the law enforcement, that first line responders are able to detect the victims, to intercept the traffickers, and to make sure that they have sufficient evidence in order to prosecute a case, or to send it to prosecution. And from the prosecution side, we need to make sure that there's enough evidence that is gathered. And all of this relates to multiple things. And you've mentioned the example of the Ugandan girls that come to Kenya for forced labor, but then they end up finding themselves in situations of trafficking for sexual exploitation or sexual abuse. And here, I again want to emphasize something that the international legal conventions, or the international conventions that I just mentioned, emphasize multiple times, and that's international cooperation. And we spoke about trafficking. I mean, it can happen domestically within Kenya, but also transnationally. It happens a lot, with a lot of people traveling from one place to another to be recruited for forced labor, for sexual exploitation, or different forms of exploitation. And then you find yourself, like the country which has the girls right now, they find themselves wondering like how to get evidence from other countries, how to make sure that some of the victims end up arriving at the country, whether it's Kenya or other countries, they end up arriving with falsified documents. So countries need to have stronger laws on punishing anyone who alters or falsifies documents such as passports and so on. They need to have stronger border control. They need to cooperate with other countries or other member states as well, to make sure that they have enough evidence, enough information to punish the traffickers. They need to have laws that protect the victims to avoid the re-victimization. So best practices, of course, having stronger laws that are aligned with the international legal standards will touch upon many things, starting with identification of victims and interception of traffickers, going into the investigation and prosecution phases, as well as the protection of victims of trafficking, and to make sure they're not re-victimized. So definitely stronger laws, but also implementation of it, and that's something that we've talked about earlier, making sure that there's strengthened national coordination and communication between the different stakeholders that combat trafficking. And here, I want to say that you spoke about milestones, and having a specialized anti-trafficking unit like the ones we have in Kenya, that are specialized with experts on investigation and prosecution of trafficking in persons cases specifically. This is very, very important in the fight against trafficking, and to have experts that are aware of like how this crime manifests itself, whether sex trafficking or more broadly just trafficking. Also, because children as well, we were talking about how children and young girls are disproportionately affected by such a crime. It is very important to have an approach that takes into account children's needs and rights as well. So, for example, within the specialized anti-trafficking units, you can have child protection units as well embedded. That's, for example, one of the best practices I have in mind. Also, something that maybe we haven't spoken about yet is that, I mean, especially with the pandemic that has been going on for some time now, and shutting down of airports that happened for a while. I mean, this didn't really halt traffickers' operations. Instead, they found their way around it, and they've been using the technological advancements to traffic girls, whether it's online through, for example, recruitment of people into virtual rooms for purposes of sexual exploitation. So we also need to tackle that by looking at technological advancements to detect trafficking in persons or prevent such a crime from happening in the first place. We can look at public-private partnerships, work with the private sector, work with CSOs, work with people in the tech industry, develop applications, maybe to train local enforcement officers on what are the trafficking in persons indicators. How would you know that this person is being sex trafficked? What are the hotspots? So look also at the technological advancements, because we can't find new ways with or new forms of trafficking with our old methods. We really need to also take into consideration that traffickers are making use of the technology and the advancements in communication and information nowadays. And we also need to look at how to combat that and how to address that by using the same technologies as well for purposes of prevention of trafficking in persons, and specifically sex trafficking. These are some of the examples I have at the top of my head right now.
I won't add much more, but maybe just to bring us back to a point that Norhan had mentioned when we began, which was partnerships. Maybe just to place emphasis on partnerships as a good practice. Partnerships not just amongst civil society, which I think has been operating for quite some time now. I think there are very many NGOs, CSOs that are working within the trafficking, but specifically sex trafficking area, each providing services to survivors and victims of sex trafficking in different ways, from the legal support offered by yourselves and other organizations that are, trying to make justice accessible for victim survivors, to organizations that have come together to offer that sort of physical, psychosocial, and whatever other forms of support that a survivor or victim would need. So I think there has been a lot of working together in these different groupings, but I think to take it to the next level, there's probably a need to have that more cross-sectional cooperation between different organs in order to ensure that the commitments that the government has made under all these international obligations are actually translated into some sort of lived reality. There was also the recent participation leadership of the Kenyan government in the Gender Equality Forum. Still waiting to see the extent to which those commitments that have been made within that platform will actually translate into something tangible. But I think part of the conversations that happened during that time was to try and locate sex trafficking within GBV discourse. And to that extent, then see the extent to which we can hold government accountable for its failures, or remind them of their commitments within that specific forum. So I think that's also an opportunity that hopefully we are able to take full advantage of, leveraging on partnerships, not just amongst civil society, for example, not just amongst the different criminal justice sector actors, not just amongst policy drivers, but like a true collaboration and true partnership, as Norhan had mentioned, to be able to move those commitments forward.
All right. It is very interesting that we have situations that, if, for example, when you're talking of sex trafficking happening through digital means, because we've seen a lot of that, especially with the lockdown with COVID-19. The traffickers adjusted and they still continued exploiting young women, young girls sexually by creating such content and selling it online. Okay. So my follow-up question from this, because we are still trying to have our audience understand exactly what sex trafficking is. They've understood the laws that are available in terms of fighting human trafficking as well as fighting sex trafficking, maybe the milestones that we've managed to achieve, or maybe the milestones that we have, in terms of this whole process since it was identified as a crime. So I have two questions within the same scope of sex trafficking. And one is on the view of child marriage, where how do we link that up? Because we have situations where child marriage is more and more being being accepted as a form of trafficking. For us, it is already, we know this is a form of trafficking, but globally it is being more accepted. So where is that link between child marriage and sex trafficking and sex exploitation? And then secondly, we've been talking of cases being reported, being of women and young girls, okay? But we know as well that sex trafficking is also happening to men, and it's happening to boys. So what are the gaps? Why is that existing in that manner in terms of numbers?
Perhaps, Rahima, I'm just going to talk about from the international legal perspective on exploitation and the definition of exploitation, or the definition of trafficking that we spoke about with regards to the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. And with regards to the definition of what trafficking in persons is, exploitation really doesn't have a specific definition under international law. And the reason behind that, the reason that there's no universal definition on what exploitation is could be multiple things that the drafters of the protocol had in mind. One is that to bear in mind the national and cultural context when it comes to different forms of exploitation. So, for example, prostitution can be criminalized in one country but regulated in another, or not criminalized in another country. And within the international legal standards, there was a reason that the Trafficking in Persons Protocol just kept exploitation by specifying minimum forms of exploitative behaviors and encouraging member states to only include these forms, not to only to include these forms as exploitative behaviors, but also gave a non-exhaustive list, meaning that countries could, depending on their national and cultural context, add different forms of exploitation to the list that exists under international law. And we've seen in many countries that forced marriage or child marriage specifically, like you just mentioned, are one of the forms of exploitations that were added specifically in different national legislation globally. But when it comes to trafficking under the international legal standards, there is no specific requirement for countries to prohibit child marriage, but it leaves it open as well for countries to incorporate it if within their national context child marriage manifests itself as an issue of exploitation as well.
And maybe if we look at the definition of trafficking in persons under the Counter-Trafficking Act, you commit the offense of trafficking when you, amongst other, receive another person for the purpose of exploitation. Now, this act actually goes further and defines what trafficking for sexual exploitation means. So within that context, if viewers would go back to the act itself, trafficking for sexual exploitation is linked specifically to the commission of an offense under the Sexual Offences Act. The Sexual Offences Act, I think, specifically prohibits underage sex. And I think that is where those linkages are drawn, because as the name suggests, child marriage is a marriage with someone who is under the age of 18. And as defined within the Sexual Offences Act, that is, what's the technical term? No, the term fails me now. But within that context, then what you are technically involved in, according to the definition of the Act, is sexually exploitative behavior, because what you're doing is, as provided by the Act, harboring or receiving a person for the purpose of exploitation. I think in a technical legal sense, I guess that's where that comes from. Yeah. What is the other question with respect to the disparity between the numbers of victims or survivors that are male and that are female. I mean, that's rooted in very many things. I think generally, globally, the vulnerabilities that girls and boys are exposed to, I think are different. But I mean, you also have to consider the intersectional nature of vulnerabilities. So it's not all girls or not all boys who would be more likely to be trafficked. I think if you consider geography, if you consider social status,
Hello.
Am I back now?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Please.
My very disrespectful internet. Lost my train of thought. Yes. I mean, we also need to consider the intersectional nature thereof. But I think on that basis, then generally, I think for sexual exploitation purposes, more girls tend to be trafficked. And Norhan, you can supplement with some of the statistics that the UNODC receives in this respect. But I think due to prevailing gender and social norms and social constructs, I think it is more likely that a girl or a woman will be trafficked. And even where there are men who are trafficked, it is less likely that they will speak about it or it will be shared as a statistic due to prevailing gender and other cultural norms that render it almost taboo to speak about a male victim of trafficking. Because I think if you have like a general conversation with people in the street, even the thought of a boy or a man being trafficked, won't come to the fore in the way other forms of gender-based violence, which are also experienced by men, are not spoken about as much. So I think that helps to account for some of the differences. Certainly, not all of them, but I think off the top of my head, that would be perhaps one of the contributing reasons as to why there's a difference between the number of male and female victims and survivors.
Thanks, Yvonne. I'll just add to what you're saying. I mean, in the Global Trafficking in Persons report, it was reported that globally, for every 10 victims, 5 of the victims were adult women and 2 of them were young girls. So this is why when we were talking from the start, Yvonne was saying women and young girls are disproportionately affected by trafficking in persons more generally and sex trafficking crimes more specifically. So that's some of the statistics. And also we were talking about sexual exploitation as a term, and sexual exploitation is a broad term generally, and it could include a number of acts that are described differently in national legislation, but that could include like transactional sex, solicitation of transaction sex, or like Yvonne mentioned, an exploitative relationship, and that's when it becomes, it manifests itself, like specifically sex trafficking, whether there's an element of exploitative relationship when we're looking at different forms of exploitation like child marriage, and looking at children that are under 18 and that are part of an exploitative relationship when they're forced to marry at that age. So that's something also that Yvonne mentioned that I wanted to reflect on.
Thank you very much. So I'll welcome my colleague Winnie, so she can also ask a few questions on this specific topic.
Thank you, Rehema, and thank you, Nohan and Yvonne. Really, very informative discussion so far. And I think maybe I just want to just have a quick follow-up on what you've been able to mention right now. Looking at how support is offered a victim and a perpetrator. However, when we look at how the community or the society really perceives victims of sexual exploitation. There's a lot of stigma around it where you're shunned, actually you're the one who is being blamed for what happened to you. And so looking at them being able to receive support, then it becomes a challenge. And so I think for me, a question would be around with what is done currently within our communities, what do we need to be more aware of as community members? How are we victims of these crimes? What needs to be done differently? As we've talked about it, women and girls are more affected. Even looking at the gender lens that needs to be utilized, but just looking at the community level, what needs to be considered? What needs to be encouraged for us to be able to have more support than being offered to victims, instead of them not being treated as perpetrators, or them then again being blamed for being abused.
I mean, something to consider. I mean, if we're looking at the community level, most importantly, let's look at some prevention efforts. So when it comes to raising awareness on trafficking in persons as a crime and sex trafficking and how it disproportionately affects women and young girls, but also affects male victims as well. So we need to raise awareness, whether through media campaigns, whether through other forms of information as well, like having, and that's a responsibility that falls on different stakeholders in the community. So it falls upon the international organizations that are working to prevent and combat trafficking within, if we're talking domestically, so within Kenya. We're talking about CSOs that are working more on a grassroots level and that they have more leverage to talk to communities. We can also have community leaders, so people that are well respected within the community, to provide different sessions to different members in the community on trafficking as a crime, what are the trafficking in persons indicators, how they can support people that are affected by this crime, potential victims. So let's look at the prevention efforts. Let's raise awareness on trafficking in general within the community, through distributing information, through distinguishing what trafficking is from other crimes, how it disproportionately affects victims, and how can we prevent victims from being lured into being trafficked by traffickers that end up exploiting them. So definitely raising awareness is an important issue. And if we're talking about communal efforts as well, I mean, protection, even when it's provided by civil society organization, government stakeholders, or other individuals working within the community, it is very important to have measures in place that provide support to the victims that want to come forward. So, for example, people that are at risk of being trafficked for sexual exploitation, they need to be aware that there are mechanisms in place where they can report such a crime if they think that something is happening that will likely get them into a situation where they're being sexually exploited or being trafficked. There needs to be mechanisms at a local level, and if we're looking at the criminal justice system, for example, to have mechanisms where these individuals that may be subjected to trafficking for sexual exploitation or other forms of exploitation as well, the individuals that need to have a place to report such a crime, to make sure that whatever their report is also confidential, because you were talking about the stigma aspect of it, and the stigma aspect and the fear of being known that you that you have been subjected to sex trafficking makes a lot of people actually not report such a crime or refrain from doing so. And that also means that we're lacking a lot of data when it comes to trafficking in persons on a communal level, and specifically sex trafficking as well. So it is very important, aside from raising awareness, is to have mechanisms in place to encourage individuals to report such a crime or to report suspected crimes. And that also means that it is the responsibility of different stakeholders that work on trafficking, including CSOs, including international organizations, including members of the community, but also from a government perspective as well, to make sure that, for example, the law enforcement or the local police station that will take, that victims are encouraged to go to report such a crime, can at least ensure the confidentiality of their statements, to make sure that any, if this amounts to a crime that will be prosecuted, or there will be court proceedings, then to make sure that these proceedings are also confidential, to avoid the re-victimization of people that are subjected to sex trafficking. So these are very, very important issues to bear in mind when we're looking at what can we do better to whether to prevent sex trafficking or to protect the victims of such a crime, and to encourage reporting of such a crime as well, in order to effectively prevent it and combat it.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. We just have to raise more awareness on sex trafficking as a crime, the pervasive nature, the manifestations, tackle or highlight the vulnerabilities that exist, that make it such that certain groups of girls and women are more likely to be trafficked. I think in many instances, sometimes in child trafficking even, parents are not fully aware that the behaviors that they're involved in actually do qualify in terms of the definition of trafficking. So we really do just need to do more. And we collectively, it's not a duty that rests on civil society, because I think civil society really does do a lot, or has taken on a chunk of the work when it comes to offering this support. That raising awareness is something that the government should also be involved in. It's part of civic duty, just raising awareness on what the legal framework is, making laws accessible to people who are not, Willie and Nohan and Rehema who have the privilege of that level of education, who are able to look at an act and understand what it's saying. It needs to be disseminated, translated, made accessible in whatever different platforms, just so that people are actually aware that sex trafficking manifests in these different ways, to be able to, in the first instance, prevent, but where you identify a victim of trafficking, it makes it easier to speak out. And in that respect, there's also a lot of knowledge that needs to be shared with these different institutions, from the police to a hospital. If a victim of trafficking ends up in the hospital and needs to receive primary care, how do you respond? What duty rests on you as a caregiver to refer the case? What are the mechanisms that ensure that smooth transition? I think there's no specific coordination between these different organs, which means sometimes things fall in the cracks. But ultimately, I think a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it does come down to just the knowledge on sex trafficking, what it is, how it manifests, the fact that it's a crime, the duty that rests on different actors in a social context to respond. If you're the police, if you are a health worker, if you're an educator who notices that a child has experienced trafficking, if you are, you know, an airport worker at the airport, if you are in a store, for example, and two people come in and a situation looks a little bit suspicious, how do you respond? You know, just that knowledge and just speaking about sex trafficking, putting a spotlight on it, will also maybe help to demystify it as a crime. And maybe then, of course, it's not overnight, but maybe then also some of this stigmatization, I guess that's rooted in a lack of knowledge, because you don't really know. You make a lot of assumptions about victims and survivors of trafficking and how they ended up in those situations. But if you speak about it, if you demystify, if you debunk, if you actually share what the situation is, what the laws are, what the appropriate responses are, I think that goes some way with respect to redressing or addressing the challenges highlighted.
Thank you very much, Yvonne and Nohan. Yes, Nohan, you want to add?
I just wanted to add two small points to add to what Yvonne was saying. Yvonne was talking about, I mean, the lack of knowledge generally, and how people will be able to detect or know what happens if a situation, if someone comes in, a situation looks very like a little suspicious, what to do. And here I want to get back a little bit to the role of the government in that, and the role of the different stakeholders that work on combating trafficking, whether it's law enforcement, immigration, customs, and so on. For example, if there's a situation that if someone comes into an airport and the person that is at immigration sees us is suspicious about the situation, but there isn't enough available information to indicate whether this is trafficking or not trafficking or what exactly this is, but something seems suspicious. There needs to be also, and this is something that UNODC is working on across the region with different countries as well, is to have, and again, it comes down to the implementation of the law, like we were just saying, having standard operating procedures, having directives, having regulations, having sort of a checklist for people or the first line responders that end up detecting or intercepting trafficking crimes, whether at the airport or other ports of entry, if we're talking about a crime that is transnational in nature. Then have a checklist saying, well, these are the indicators of what trafficking could look like. If you're faced with such a situation, here's what you need to do. Call law enforcement, do this. So there's some sort of checklist in order for people that are working in the criminal justice, from the criminal justice side as well, to know what they need to do, or to have some sort of coherent approach to intercept more trafficking cases as well. So that's something that Yvonne mentioned. So I think taking it back to the criminal justice aspect and having more standard operating procedures or directives or regulations to operationalize the existing laws is very, very important, to make sure that the people who are working to combat such a crime on the government level are also able to deal with it and intercept it at the right time, so that it's not too late. And something else that was mentioned by Yvonne relates to available knowledge and available information. And this is where it's important to indicate that data collection on trafficking in persons and on sex trafficking is very important. And it is actually one of the major challenges that were mentioned in the Global Trafficking in Persons report, that is, there's a scarcity of data on trafficking, and that's why the numbers may not be reflective of the reality that's happening on the ground. I mean, they do give a bit of a reflection of what's going on, what are the major forms of exploitation, and so on. But lack of reporting on trafficking, whether due to stigmatization or lack of reporting by victims, or this, all of this leads to it weakens the approaches to effectively combat such a crime. When we don't have enough data about trafficking or sex trafficking in specific, then we won't be able to effectively tackle it. And here we need to tackle the sex trafficking crime and look at the root causes. I mean, we spoke about raising awareness as one of the preventive measures, but we also need to take a look at to have more research to look at what causes sex trafficking crime to happen. Is it because of people are not having access to adequate income opportunities, they're not able to find jobs? Well, let's find them more jobs. Then that's what we need to do. On the prevention side, then we would need to look at providing access to income opportunities, working with different organizations or the government itself providing more opportunities for jobs, if that's one of the reasons that encourages people to get involved in such a crime, and that allows people to be exploited eventually for sexual exploitation. So we need to also look at systemic solutions, but in order to do so, we also need to have more research and more data on the causes of such a crime. I think that's in addition to what Yvonne was saying.
Thank you very much, Nohan and Yvonne. Yeah, definitely in agreement. Many things need to get done. And even looking at how we involve the different stakeholders, the first responders, the communities, really all of us have a role to play. But maybe something I want us to break it down even further. We've talked about indicators which we should be able to use, actually be able to tell, is this a case of trafficking or not? I think I'll request if Nohan could be able to just stipulate for us, what are these key indicators for us to be able to look into? As someone who maybe my neighbor might be engaged in something suspicious, what does this mean when I'm saying there's some suspicion around what is happening in my neighbor's space? What are these key indicators to look into? We're looking at sex trafficking. And maybe for Yvonne, if you can be able to give us simple case studies. When we talk of sex trafficking, what does this look like in our communities? How does it actually happen? When you're talking about even some parents being involved and not being aware, what does this mean? So I can be able just to break it down to a level where I can be able to see, oh, actually what is happening in my neighbor's place sounds similar to what you're able to share. Maybe a few case studies from you, Yvonne, and then Nohan, if you're able to just share the key indicators for sex trafficking.
Yeah, I don't know if I will be able to share my screen, but I would actually like to share a leaflet that we have in UNODC that has a list of human trafficking indicators, whether it's general indicators or more specifically indicators that are related to children and so on. And I think this could be a very beneficial resource or material that can be disseminated that could alert individuals to, something suspicious is going on here. Let me alert the officials, or let me talk to my friend. Let me try to share my screen. I'm not sure if I will be able to.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Can you see it? Not sure if you are able to see it. Are you able to see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is one of the UNODC material that we have, and it is like a small leaflet that has bullet points on indicators of human trafficking. And these are just examples that are not by all means exhaustive, but could help individuals say, yeah, this is a suspicious situation. And let me take you to some of the examples. So general indicators of trafficking could be someone believing that they have to work against their will, someone having fear or anxiety, someone being subjected to violence or threats against themselves and their family members, someone who's suffering from injuries, possibly due to sexual exploitation, possibly due to different forms of exploitation, someone who is distrustful of the authorities. So these are just indicators. There are a lot. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they could be helpful for different people, whether people that work on the communal level, or as well as even government officials that are able to detect such a suspicious behavior generally. And when it comes to children, I mean, I want to take you here to the point where someone who has no access in education, or someone who has even dropped out of school, this could be a sign. Someone who is engaged in work that is not suitable for children. I mean, that could be suspicious. We might be looking at a situation of exploitation for forced labor. I mean, this tool is actually very, very helpful. And if you would like, I'm happy to share it afterwards. It's publicly available as well. But it does have different tools for trafficking in persons, and here as well on sexual exploitation as well, which is very relevant to this discussion. So people who have been trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation may be of any age, may work long hours, may have only know how to say sex-related words in the local language, have no cash of their own. There could be evidence that a person has been bought and sold, that evidence that someone is under the control of someone else. So these are just different examples of indicators that may help someone know, oh, this I read this somewhere, this might actually be a suspicious behavior that I'll either talk to my friend who's involved in this about, or even report it to local law enforcement or officials as well. So I'm happy to share this as well with you afterwards. Winnie, you are on mute.
Thank you very much, Nohan. Definitely quite detailed, and I think will be very useful for very many of us to be able to really reference generally looking at human trafficking, but also being specific on different forms of exploitation. I think it will definitely be a useful tool for us to share with our audience. Thank you for that. Over to you, Yvonne. Case studies, how does this actually happen in our day-to-day engagement?
I think there's some examples that are quite, I don't want to say obvious, but have captured national discourse, including, I think the matter, was it you or Rehema who mentioned the brothel that had the women who they were young girls and young women who were actually being held as sex slaves. I think that's a very clear example of sex trafficking. And I think when you think about sex trafficking, that's like the most prevalent manifestation. Women who are brought from other countries or maybe other parts of Kenya and are put together, and people come and they buy sex. But I think some of the examples that I have or we have interacted with through the different partners that we work with, especially at the coast and in Naivasha, are, for example, I understand that there's certain, or parents will send a child, let's say from other counties to go and live with a relative at the coast, or in an area that's known for sex tourism especially. And the person under whose charge they are will, for example, liaise with hotels or other such establishments such that a guest will come, and I guess there are coded words that are used, and it would be clear that if this is a service that you want, it's something that we would be able to offer you. And sometimes so here you have a child who's been put under the charge of someone, of a trusted relative, whose services are now being procured for purposes of that form of exploitation. We hear very many stories of young girls who move to other parts or move to the city, for example, or move within the city under the guise of domestic servitude, which is in and of itself problematic. But once they're in that situation, you find that either within the household or in the community, that there are people who take advantage of them. So if you let me do this, then I will give you 200 shillings to buy some airtime, or I'll buy you a dress, or sometimes it's through force or coercion. So in that way, I think that's another form of trafficking for sexual exploitation. I think, as mentioned, and I think this is something Rehema also said, I think child marriages would probably also fall within this category, because if you speak to some parents, you know, they give their daughter, their underage daughter, to an older man for marriage, accepting that he will now take care of the family by virtue of that marriage relationship. So child marriage in and of itself problematic, but I think if you also look at our definition of trafficking in persons, and if you look at our definition of sexual exploitation, then I think that definitely could be construed as a sex trafficking context. So it manifests itself in so many ways, some more obvious than others, such as the brothels, but there are others that, you know, the lines are not always so clear. But looking at the definition of the act, then I think it would certainly fall within that specific description.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And I think the more you speak, I know we've looked at the legal framework. We have the Palermo Protocol, we have so many protocols, we have the Kenyan Act, Sexual Offences, we have Trafficking in Persons Act, where we are looking at really how can we be able to deter and also really discourage this from happening. But I think there's one industry in specific that is heavily affected. This is looking at the hospitality and leisure industry, where when you're looking at trafficking, even looking at what Yvonne was sharing, hotels really being used heavily, resorts being utilized, massage parlors being utilized as well, and restaurants, pubs and all. So my question would be, is there enough being done really to regulate what happens in these spaces? And what more needs to be done? Because we still have trafficking still happening, you know? Sex trafficking still continues to thrive. And as Rehema was able to mention, as well as Nohan, yes, we still had the lockdowns. Maybe some hotels were shut down, but we had the traffickers now using our spaces, Airbnb, homes being rented for that, our own homes also being used for streaming live these incidents. So what more needs to get done? Because we see, yes, they become smarter. Definitely they're criminals. But what more needs to be done? How are we getting smarter as well to be able to catch up with them? What is being done and what needs to get done for us to get to a point where we can say we are able to easily identify perpetrators and actually hold them accountable?
If I can pick up the second half of the sentence also, Winnie, that you mentioned how to hold perpetrators accountable. I mean, it is very important to hold them accountable, but it also is important to make sure that they're punished sufficiently for the crimes that they have done. And for such a grave crime such as sex trafficking, it is very important that the punishment is also compared to what a serious crime punishment is. And that's when I'll take you back to something that we also mentioned earlier with regards to the law or the national anti-trafficking legislation or different legislation as well that address sex trafficking crimes. It is very important to make sure that such a crime is punished with sufficient prison terms. I mean, ideally, as opposed to imposing fines, it would be I mean, it would show how serious such a crime is if there are sufficient prison terms that offenders would be subjected to when they get involved in sex trafficking, and that speaks to the deterrent effect of the law. I mean, the act or the laws have to have provisions to prosecute traffickers, yes, provide remedy for victims and so on, but substituting like the sufficient imprisonment term for fines, for example, or reducing the punishments for these offenders creates a gap that actually reduces the seriousness of such a crime. It reduces the seriousness of sex trafficking, and traffickers know that they're gonna get out of it by being subjected to less punishment. So lesser sentences for offenders limits the deterrent effect that the national legislation should have across different countries. Thereby, like, it defeats actually the object and purpose of the whole anti-trafficking legislation, which one of its aims is to prosecute the traffickers and the offenders. I mean, if the offenders know that they will get out of it by paying a fine or by having by being subjected to less punishment, it's less likely to deter other people from doing it. So it is very, very important to have punishments that are sufficiently stringent and have sufficient imprisonment terms to, as much as possible, try to make sure that the sentencing for such a crime is grave enough to make other people less likely to resort to it or do it. So it has this like deterrent effect.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Norhan, especially because of something you mentioned, Winnie, that it seems like we just evolve in terms of our criminality. As you've mentioned, the pandemic has forced even criminals to be innovative in how they engage in their criminal activity. So to that extent, then you can only legislate so much, not taking away from the importance of having these provisions, as mentioned by Norhan, for that deterrent effect. But the truth is, you know, because of this evolution, what then can you do in response? And I think Norhan had already mentioned this, that is, when you engage in the research, when you gather the data, when you call sex trafficking what it is and describe it with evidence, then it's easier for you to be able to craft an appropriate response. So the fact that we don't have enough data on sex trafficking as a standalone crime, I think, is problematic for how we hope to respond to it. Because then what is it grounded in? The fact that there has been some research, but perhaps there could be more that's done on the ways in which it continues to evolve and manifest in our society relative to the global sphere, because as mentioned by Nohan, it's something that you note in a national context, but it's also very transnational in its reach in many instances. So just bringing it back to what she had mentioned, especially because of what you said, the evolution of criminality means that you constantly have to be on it. You have to research, you have to gather the data, and based on what's coming out there, look at the law and see how you need to respond in order to ensure that people are being held accountable for that deterrent effect.
Thank you, Yvonne and Nohan. Yeah, so just to say, we are not defeated. A lot is being done. And with what we have as legislation, we are able to still be able to do more. I think it's just being more organized as well, and more coordination required for us to really be able to catch up and also outsmart the criminals within this space. And I think as we get into wrapping up, looking into the future, Yvonne, you had mentioned the National Equality Forum, which was ongoing. We had people going to Paris. We have these discussions. What does this mean to Kenyans, those who've been following the discussion? What would the outcome of this forum really mean to Kenyans looking at sex trafficking?
I think in the way the Beijing Platform for Action did, it offers an interesting framework for accountability. So that's not to say that it's going to be the solution to all of the GBV problems that Kenya has. But the Kenyan government did take a stand when it comes to certain commitments related to gender-based violence. And I think that can be a good platform on which we advocate for the government to commit to implementing as it provided itself as part of this gender equality forum. So across the board, in all of the different fora that we interact with, the commitments that the government has adopted, I think, would be a good accountability and advocacy mechanism for the prevention of and response to gender-based violence in Kenya, especially. And I think what was particularly interesting for me was the location of sex trafficking within discourse around gender-based violence, which I think is something that hasn't been done as much as it should have. And I think on that basis, then we have more of a leg to stand on when it comes to holding the government accountable for the commitments that it's made under this specific platform. But as we know, it's not easy. So it's, an unrelenting engagement and a reminder in all of the platforms and all of the spaces that you occupy in your spheres of influence. The government, like no one forced the government of Kenya to stand up and make those commitments. So on that basis, if these are the things that you have committed to do, then do them. And if not, why? If it's something that's within our power to support, then certainly I think different sectors of society have generally rallied around certain issues for the overall good. So in that respect, I think then it offers an interesting space or another level of accountability for commitments that the Kenyan government has made on its own with respect to gender-based violence.
I would like to add to what Yvonne was saying as well in terms of the commitments that the Kenyan government made, like specifically when we're talking about the context of Kenya. UNODC has actually been working extensively with the government of Kenya, whether it's on trafficking in persons or smuggling of migrants or other broader organized crime as well. And it is important to emphasize that commitments are also emphasized by the number of the different international legal conventions that the government has ratified, and that automatically places them under obligation to prevent certain crimes, specifically in this context when we're talking about trafficking in persons. And we have been working even for the past couple of weeks with the government of Kenya, and they have been very receptive, specifically with the Counter-Trafficking in Persons Secretariat, to making sure that they're adequately preventing and countering trafficking in persons by looking at the gaps in national legislation, looking at the need to harmonize different laws when it comes to trafficking in persons, looking at the gaps in national coordination, what needs to be done. And we've had this discussion with the government, and the government itself has committed to strengthening its Counter-Trafficking in Persons Act. So that's something that we are currently working on with the Kenyan government, and it shows the commitment to counter trafficking in persons as a crime, and that is inclusive of sex trafficking as a crime that happens within this context. So definitely it is one of the, it's an ongoing fight generally against trafficking, and we keep on we would keep on addressing different laws, having different measures, working at the grassroots level. So just having also a multi-stakeholder approach by everyone working at a different level to combat trafficking in persons and broadly like organized crime. This is definitely the commitment that we're currently seeing with the government, and we're working with them to support their engagement and their wish to strengthen their own national anti-trafficking legislation and any other gaps in national coordination as such. And I mean, this is part of the next steps that would hopefully, if we're talking about the context of Kenya, intensify the fight against trafficking, and to make sure that traffickers are sufficiently punished for the offenses that they commit, to make sure that the national stakeholders that are working on trafficking in persons are also have the sufficient knowledge and are have strengthened capacity to combat such a crime as well. So that's something that's definitely that UNODC has been working on recently with the government, and it's something to highlight as well in this discussion.
Thank you, Nohan. So we see clearly a highlight on having political will, really, to be able to see different things being addressed. Looking at what you're referring to, the act, looking at how we're able to address different gaps, and what Yvonne is sharing about the government really making commitments, and to seeing more being done with what is already in place. And I think as we wrap it up, that's a good thing for us to know what's happening. But I think at the end of the day, we can have so much being done at the policy level, but then more needs to get done at the grassroots level, really, for us to actually see the actual change that needs to be seen. And right now, looking at the year 2020, we've had the Panama Protocol in place for 20 years now. And we've had the Act in Kenya being in place for more than 10 years now, because in 2021, it was in place since 2010. And so this is also the month we get to commemorate the World Day Against Human Trafficking. Then my question would be, from the two of you, with us having this discussion, reflecting back to the previous 10 years, what has been done, the milestones, the gaps you still see, what is being done to be able to address the different challenges, then what message do we have generally for the community? What do we need to be able to really work towards? What needs to be a commitment from the community members as well towards us being able to really counter human trafficking in all its manifestations? Today focusing on sex trafficking, but just overall for the community, and also just looking at other stakeholders that are involved in this space. Just a message just to the two key stakeholders, the community and other stakeholders within the space. I know it's a long one, needs some reflection, but yes, it's a journey. It's been a journey. Looking at it 20 years down the line, 10 years down the line, looking ahead.
I mean, from UNODC perspective, we've been systematically looking at data when it comes to trafficking in persons. And I think part of the milestones is also seeing additional ratifications to the international legal conventions as it relates to UNTOC, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, as well as the Supplementing Trafficking and Smuggling Firearms Protocol. I mean, seeing more ratifications means there's more countries that are committed to combating this crime. And I think there was also, like, for the past period as well, with the increasing ratifications, with the increasing awareness about trafficking and the effects that it has, there's also this realization that trafficking negatively impacts societies in all, I mean, it impacts society's progress, it impacts the economy, it impacts peace, security, human rights. So it touches upon different aspects of society, and traffickers prey on that and take advantage of the country's resources while they're exploiting or while they're performing different forms of exploitations as well. So definitely we're seeing more awareness, more ratification, more countries that are committed to combat trafficking. There's also this the element of the transnational aspect of trafficking has been made, I mean, clear with the different case studies, different cases of showing just like how complex also trafficking can be. Like, of course, trafficking can happen domestically, but it is very, very difficult for someone that looks at a crime to see like all elements of the trafficking crime, the act, the means, and the purpose are happening right in front of you. So it's very easy to look at it. It's actually much more complex than that. And it can also involve different and more broader organized crime. So the transnational aspect of it is something that became more evident perhaps in the past 10 years. And that's why there's also this increasing emphasis to strengthen international cooperation between different countries, because there's this realization that no matter how powerful a country is, it is going to be very, very difficult to combat trafficking, especially the crimes that are have a transnational aspect to it. It's going to be hard to get that evidence from abroad, to prevent the victims from going back or being repatriated to their country because and they don't want to give evidence in court. Like, there's the emphasis on international cooperation is something that the international conventions emphasize so much. And I think with the increasing commitment that we're seeing from countries, there's also this willingness to work more on international cooperation, to work more on strengthening laws, to work more on strengthening national coordination and cooperation on trafficking and other cases as well. So these are some of the things that we've been seeing, and that will automatically lead to
We seem to have lost Nohan. Maybe Yvonne, you could respond as we wait on Nohan. Thank you. The call
Okay.
to action.
Call to action. I think what I would say is the amount of time that has passed is not that long. I think 10 years seems like a long time, but it's not. And we still have a long way to go, especially because we're dealing with an interconnected, a deeply insidious, a very hidden crime that is not often spoken about and not many people understand. So in that context, I think it would just be a call to keep talking about sex, about trafficking, because I think now trafficking is, in general, something that we speak about often. But now we need to shift gears a little bit and focus on sex trafficking as a specific form of trafficking and all of the challenges that arise in that context. I think globally, there is also an acceptance that there's a need to begin to speak a little bit more in a very targeted way about sex trafficking, including through the general recommendation, I think it was by CEDAW. Let me just see if I can get the name right. The general recommendation number 38, which focuses on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration. I think that's just an indication that sex trafficking may not have been spoken about as much as it needed to, but we are slowly beginning to just put a spotlight on sex trafficking. So to just continue being alert and being aware and asking questions and reporting suspicious behavior and just being unrelenting, because 10, 20 years may seem like a long time, but it really does take an inordinate amount of time to be able to change broader systemic issues. So in that respect, even though it may not seem like there's a lot of movement that is happening in that context. I think based on our discussion today, it's clear that there are many small steps that are happening, the effect of which will probably only be felt a little bit in the future, but we need to continue speaking about sex trafficking and demystifying and debunking a lot of those myths and just putting a spotlight on this global phenomenon that is deeply problematic, but also very hidden and insidious.
Thank you, Yvonne. Nohan, unfortunately, we lost you when you were speaking. I can actually remind you exactly at what spot we left you. You were talking about the crime being transnational and the need for governments to be able to actually work together and looking at victims being able to really testify for these cases, what needs to get done. So that's when we lost you and then you just froze. If you're able to recollect and finalize on your statement, I think you can at this stage.
Yeah, I think to finalize on my statement and look more towards also next step, aside from the reflection, is, I mean, the importance of data collection is actually one of the recommendations that UNODC has been talking about in the Global Trafficking in Persons report and elsewhere as well with member states. I mean, it is really, really imperative that we have sufficient data in order for us to be able to tackle this crime effectively, to know exactly what causes this crime, who is the most affected, how can we tackle it. Having data is essential, and looking at that, I mean, whether it's gathering data, whether it's through reporting of victims to on sex trafficking cases or trafficking cases generally, but also looking at having mechanisms in place like a centralized data collection mechanism that the government would have, for example, to collect information related to trafficking in persons cases. I mean, this would help the different actors that are involved in the investigation and prosecution of such cases to have access to the same information so that they're able to tackle this crime effectively. So data collection is actually one of the most important things that would strengthen the fight against trafficking in persons specifically. So that's one of the next steps I want to mention. I mean, something else is that there is UNODC, I mean, when it comes to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, recently there was a launch of this review mechanism. And under this review mechanisms, member states that are party to the Palermo Protocols as well will have to report on what they have done to align with the international legal obligations. So that is something that we will likely see a lot of action as well from different governments across the region and elsewhere of additional measures being taken to combat trafficking, strengthening laws, looking at more the implementation and so on, as well as prevention efforts, protection of victims. So I think the launch of this mechanism will likely push a little bit countries and member states of the conventions to strengthen the fight to counter and combat trafficking in persons. So that's one of the next steps that I feel like for the upcoming period, I think will be very helpful when it comes to combating trafficking.
Thank you very much, Nohan. And I think for us to conclude, I would want to ask Nohan, Yvonne, as well as Rehema to just share. For us to continue with this discussion, online, be it someone wants to reach out to any, maybe the mention of the different handles for Equality Now, for UNODC, and for Rehema for Heart Kenya. What are these places? How can we continue with the discussion? We can start with you, Yvonne.
So, yes, I think Equality Now is on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And I think they are under the handle Equality Now. So you would probably be able to find them under any of those. To say once again, it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube under the handle Equality Now. You can also look at our website, www.equalitynow.org. And if you look through the website, you'll find a specific hyperlink to an end sex trafficking page. You can also look to the resources that we have, which link to some of the publications that we've done, but also some of the publications that we've worked on with and through the different partners. I also welcome emails. So I'm on the website. You can find me. I think my contact details are there as well.
Nohan, thank you very much, Yvonne.
Thank you very much. So I am also available by email, but definitely everyone is also welcome to go through our website, specifically the Eastern Africa branch through the main UNODC website. And that also includes all of our programming that we do under broader organized crime, or specifically trafficking in persons. So a lot of information on what we actually do is in there, but we're also very active when it comes to our Twitter account, and you will find that most of our activities are tweeted on there with the different partners that we work on. So that's also one of the outlets that you would resort to when you're looking at the different activities that UNODC is implementing across the region. And our handle on Twitter is UNODC Eastern Africa.
Thank you, Nohan. You've mentioned you're available on email. You want to share the email or not?
It is my first, so NORHAN.Tumoum, my last name, @UN.org.
Thank you very much. Rehema?
For Heart Kenya, we have our website, www.heartkenya.org. We're also available on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and we're also on LinkedIn. Yeah, and we are also on YouTube. So any of those platforms, we're able to, we can be reached through those platforms. But we also have a helpline that is very active. And this helpline is specifically for victims of trafficking. If they want to report, or if you want to report a case of a victim that you know, or if you even suspect that this could be a case of trafficking, you can feel free to reach out to us through our helpline, which is 0780-211-113.
Thank you very much. And we come to a close 2 minutes past 5. Our goal having had been 5 p.m. And we want to thank everyone who was able to join us today. Thank you very much, Yvonne, for creating the time and just being able to share your expertise in this field. Nohan, for creating your time, giving us the global perspective, the best practices, and really being able to share with the audience the key indicators for us to be able to look into. So really thank you for your time, sharing really your expertise, and Rehema for moderating the first hour of the session. I think we can come to a close and wish everyone a good day, depending on at what time you're joining us. A lovely evening for those who are within a similar timeline like us. And I think up until then, we see you in the next session. We should be on the 21st of July, right, Rehema?
Yes.
But we're looking more into the legal frameworks. Thank you very much and have a lovely, lovely evening.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. Bye.
Bye.